got over the wall and broke into Izaki's mother's bungalow. They tied her up and told her to not make a sound so they could wrap her key to Izaki's mother. And then they went to the front door of the family getting ready for bed, steadied their weapons, and just let them sit. But Izaki didn't hear anything. He didn't hear a sound as they descended upon his wife and 8-year-old daughter, tying them up and locking them inside the bathroom. He didn't hear a sound as they crept up the stairs towards him, readying their ropes and guns for what was about to happen. He didn't hear a thing until his bathroom door opened with a loud bang. There stood two mid-sized men wearing ski masks. They told him to get out of the bath right now and allowed him to go into his room and change into a towel. But what the assailants didn't realize was the home's alarm system registered the phone lines to the house as attacked and had already alerted police. They pushed their guns into Izaki's chest and told him to hurry. But Izaki tried to fight back. He had been handcuffed by the assailants, so in the scuffle he wasn't able to hold on to his towel. And in the end, he was no match for them. At about 9:30 p.m., the two attackers hauled a fully nude Ezekiel out of his home as a red car pulled up from down the street. And just like that, police arrived at the scene to find that Izaki's wife had gotten away. She actually hadn't even realized her husband had been carried away until she ran upstairs to find him. But just like the empty bathtub that was the ghost of the struggle, the rest of the house was unfortunately empty of any clues. The police had no leads. However, a few hours later, another Glico executive gets a phone call, waking him from his slumber. When he picks up the receiver, he hears what sounds like a pre-recorded voice being played on the phone. It tells him to go to one specific phone booth in Tokyo. There, he'd find an envelope with more instructions. And he just went? I shouted at the stranger telling me the story. By this point, I'm starting to feel that $5 old-fashioned. Can you believe this, though? Maybe it's just me, but I would have locked every door in my home and hid in my closet with a baseball bat. But this man went at 1:40 in the morning through the light drizzle of early spring. And when he arrived at the phone booth, sandwiched in between the phone books was a brown parcel, and inside was a note that read, "Tell anything to the police. I will definitely kill the hostage. I have friends at the police, and I will know immediately if you try to trace me. I won't negotiate. Just listen to what I say." The note then asked for 1 billion yen, which is over $19 million in today's US currency. At the time, it was the most amount of money ever demanded in a ransom by a lot. It was almost a cartoonish amount of money. By that point, hundreds of police officers were deployed to start searching for whoever was doing this.
Hello, Saver. Whether you're saving for that trip to the tropics or saving for an emergency, now it was the savings.
Jet for the holiday. Oh, man. Jet.
Towards the home. But by the time they figured that out, it had been hours since Izaki was pushed into the car. That punch was correct. In the Osaka prefecture, Izaki was taken pulled from the car and pushed into an isolated warehouse. He was dressed in a large overcoat and battered vest. He was told that his 8-year-old daughter had also been kidnapped and was in another warehouse, even though that wasn't true. For the next 6 safely, but the entire country was shaken from this event. Crimes like this were not common at all in Japan. At the time that this occurred, Japan was an incredibly safe country, often referred to as the heaven for cops because there just wasn't much violent crime to respond to. Violent criminals were discouraged from committing crimes because of how high the Japanese police's solving rate was. 97.1% of murders were solved in Japan, compared to just 73% in America at the same time. So now, they thought that maybe this was an inside job from Glico or the police, or that maybe the owner of the warehouse had something to do with it. There was no way to know that though, because the Japanese police still didn't have any leads as to who these men were, which was highly embarrassing at the time. Especially to Officer Shoji Yamamoto, one of the head police officers assigned to the case. He was obsessed with the physical evidence of the case rather than the leads being called in, which was an old school way of solving crimes in Japan. He thought that hyper-analyzing items like the coat that the kidnappers gave Azaki would turn up something, but all of the physical evidence that the police could find was either stolen or mass-produced. There was no way to trace any of it. The following month, April, proved to be worse for the police. A bottle of eye drops filled with hydrochloric acid and a letter demanding 60 million yen, which was quite the discount from 1 billion yen, arrived at Azaki's home, and days later, fires were lit at the Glico headquarters. Police arranged to hand off the money to the criminals on April 8th, but when they arrived at the designated time, no one was there to collect the money. They waited for another 2 hours before leaving. It seemed like if these criminals wanted money, they were not doing a very good job of getting it. Adding salt to the wound, on April 8th, a letter addressing the police was sent to local papers. It read, "To the Japanese police fools, are you stupid? There's so many of you. What on earth are you doing? If you are a real pro, try catching me. I'll give you a hint. It's not Azaki's relatives. It's not the Nishinomiya police. The car I used was gray. If you want new info, beg for it in the newspaper. After telling you all this, you should be able to catch me. If you don't, you are tax thieves. Shall I kidnap the head director of the prefectural police?" This directly called out the police in a very embarrassing way, which went against proper etiquette in Japan at the time. Officer Yamamoto knew they had to shut down the criminals before it got worse. And then, on May 10th, his fears were there. Another letter addressed to the police arrived at local newspapers, but this one came with a serious threat. It read, "To the poor policeman, Glico is annoying. So I injected 2 with 0.05 grams of hydrogen cyanide in the stores in the area between Nagoya and Okayama. It's not enough to kill, but the target will be hospitalized. After eating Glico, let's go to the hospital. Eat Glico and end up in the grave. Signed, Monster with 21 Faces." Monster with 21 Faces. Also sometimes translated to the Mystery Man with 21 Faces. This was a reference to a children's detective story made popular in the 1950s, The Fiend with 20 Faces. I think the 2 of what they were referring to got lost in translation, but we can assume they mean Glico products. They were saying that they had poisoned Glico candy with cyanide and left it in stores for children to find. Cyanide is an incredibly deadly poison, famously used in the Jonestown Massacre where 900 cult members ingested Flavor Aid with cyanide in it. For reference of how poisonous cyanide is, cult members that put the liquid in their mouths with the intention to spit it out and run still died from the poison. Just it touching the inside of their mouth was enough to kill. It's just that deadly. Glico stock plummeted the next day, and almost every Glico product was purged from shelves, hurting the company financially. Officer Yamamoto started getting the feeling that this was either a disgruntled former employee or a rival shareholder trying to tank the company's value. Japanese citizens, it kind of felt like the police were outsourcing the investigation to them. No one they interviewed had any information as to who was responsible for the threats, but everyone was very aware of what was going on. They had read about how Yamamoto and other officers spent months chasing leads that turned up nothing, like still searching for where the code Azaki was given was from, and laboring over what kind of typewriter the letters were being written on. Why wasn't more being done, they wondered. Why were the tips being called in ignored? With every door Yamamoto went to, you could feel the pressure mounting. But things still got worse. On June 22nd, 1984, another letter arrived at another Sankyo store. This time, it was addressed to Takashi Haga, the CEO of Marudai Group. It read, Dear Haga, I hope you know about us. Your company did so well because of Glico's mishaps. You should give us some of the money you have due to their failures. Give us 50 million yen with used 10,000 yen bills. Put 10 million yen in each white bag and wait at Ota's house in Nichi Yoshidai. Have a company's driver in a white car waiting at the front of the house. On Thursday, June 28th at 8 p.m., I will call Ota's number. Say, it's Yamada, when you pick up the phone. I'll tell you where the letter is. If you don't listen to what we say and obey us, you'll fall into the same situation as Glico. If you tell the police, we'll abduct your employees. We're stronger than the police. We have hydrochloric acid, potassium cyanide, dynamite, and guns. It's super easy to put potassium cyanide in things. Signed, Monster with 21 Faces. Ota, the man they were referring to, was the managing director of Marudai Foods. He would be getting the phone call that would direct him to a letter that had further instructions. Upon receiving this letter, Haga immediately called the Osaka police. To Haga, this was a mounting threat that would destroy his business. He saw how the threat of poisoning hurt Glico. But to the police, this was their chance to catch the criminals. They could be face to face with the monster, posing as regular people. They decided they were going to go undercover to deliver the money and make an arrest in the process. United in 28, a company driver sat in a white Corolla outside of Ota's house. The Osaka police were standing by, waiting to carry out the mission once Ota got the phone call with instructions on where to find the letter. At 8:03, Ota's phone rings. He picks it up and says, It's Yamada. And then he hears the sound of a woman's voice. But it sounds like it's been pre-recorded and is being played into the receiver. She says, The back of the tourist information map at the city bus platform south of Mitsui Bank on Seibu's department store in Takatsuki. An undercover police officer dressed as Ota loads into the Corolla and takes off with the money towards Takatsuki. He had even shaved his head to look like the balding managing director. At 8:16, the undercover police officer sees a letter taped to the back of the map. In it, there was a train ticket and instructions to load onto the last car of the 8:19 train bound for Kyoto. He was to sit in a specific window seat until he saw a white flag be raised outside of the train along the track. Then, he would lower the window and throw out the bags of money. The cop dressed as Ota, I'll call him Toyota, was accompanied by 7 other undercover police officers. Together, they boarded the next train for Kyoto, trying to not look over their shoulders and give themselves away. The monster could be anywhere, watching them. They had to keep their heads down and pretend to be the commuters they were dressed as. Once on the train, the officers were all instructed by their police captain to sit in the first car. Diko Ota was specifically instructed to not sit in the seat that the police wanted him to sit in. Their hope was that the monster, if on the train, would look to his seat and see that he wasn't there. This would force the monster to get up and move about the train looking for Ota, revealing himself. So when everyone was in their seats, they started looking around at the other people on the train to see if anyone looked suspicious. It was almost 9 p.m. on a Thursday, but the air was still hot and humid. There were some businessmen getting home late with their suit jackets off to try to combat the heat. There were also some teens running amok. Other than that, it was pretty empty. But investigators' eyes widened when they saw a man about 30 years old operating a big radio with a long antenna. Even in the 80s, this was super uncommon. The police wondered if he was maybe trying to match his radio signal to the police scanner, but there wasn't much else very sketchy about him. Then, one of the cops noticed a man in the car behind them, someone who stuck out even more than the man with the radio. Standing one car down was a man, 35 to 45 years old, wearing a gray suit and clear-rimmed glasses. He also had permed hair. On him, he had a black umbrella and a folded newspaper. He was the only man with a suit jacket on, which was strange considering how hot it was. His most defining feature, however, was his eyes. Through his glasses, investigators said that he had the eyes of a fox, scanning anxiously through the cars of people. Once he sees the undercover cop with the bag of cash, he locks in on him like a predator and walks forward into the car with all of the investigators. If he had any idea, it's unclear, but he stands about 6 feet away from the decoy Ota in the bag of cash until the train stops in Kyoto. Though multiple police officers were watching the windows, no one saw a white flag indicating it's time to dump the money, so they all exited the train at the end of the line, cash in hand. The man with the radio and the fox-eyed man also exited. 2 officers stayed with the radio man after exiting, but they were informed to let him go when one of them called headquarters on a payphone. It didn't seem like he was a real suspect. The fox-eyed man, however, followed Ota like a hawk, his eyes never leaving him. He watched as the decoy Ota walked down a flight of stairs to a lower platform. Once down there, decoy Ota ran into a restroom and the fox-eyed man stood behind a pillar, watching the restroom door with that predator glare. One of the investigators found a payphone and called the precinct. They wanted permission to stop the fox-eyed man. They had him right in their grips, but they were told to stand down. He's right there. Why didn't they just get him? I shouted at the stranger inside of the bar. Okay, at this point, I was on my third $5 old-fashioned, except this one was pink, so I had no idea what the bartender thought he was making me. But I was starting to get frustrated, and maybe I understood why the people in Japan were frustrated too. All of these resources were being poured into getting this guy, and he's right here, 6 feet in front of them, and they don't do anything? I threw down my maraschino cherry in disbelief. But the stranger explained to me that's not really the police chief wanted them to wait until the fox-eyed man had touched the duffel bag of cash before closing in on him. They needed to be sure it was really him, and they thought that moment was coming. Decoy Ota exited the restroom and sat on a bench, holding the bag. The fox-eyed man started circling him like a vulture about to descend on the carcass, about 9 feet away from him. But he still wasn't able to move. Maybe he was waiting for the exact right time. Or maybe he was catching on to the fact that this wasn't really the executive he thought he was meeting. The train back to Takatsuki arrived, and everyone, all the investigators, decoy Ota with the money, and the fox-eyed man got onto the train. At Takatsuki, they all get off, but the fox-eyed man then gets back on a train to Kyoto. A few of the officers follow, but now it feels like he knows they're on his tail. After arriving back in Kyoto, he then goes back to the platform to go back to Takatsuki. But when the train comes, he doesn't get back on. Instead, the fox-eyed man stands there for a moment, letting the car of people spill out around him. Then he slips away down a staircase. When the police go to follow him, they can't. He's gone. Disappeared into the night.
Attention shoppers! BlendJet's Black Friday sale in
Osaka. Police sketches of the fox-eyed man soon litter the city. With each flyer that was hung, the public lost more and more faith in the Osaka police force. They had the 21-face monster, or at least one of them, right in front of their faces. This nightmare should be over. They shouldn't be fearing their kids buying candy. But just as the name suggests, a monster that can shift identity stores throughout Hyogo, Kyoto, and Osaka also alerted police that they had candy bars with the typed messages on them. Some of the bars went in for testing, and it was confirmed. They all contained lethal doses of cyanide. The next day, another typed letter was sent to newspapers, but this time it was addressed to the mothers in Japan. It read, "To all the mothers in Japan, in autumn, appetite is huge. Candy is great. When you think sweets, no matter what you say, it's Morinaga, right? We added some special flavor to it. The flavor of potassium cyanide is a little bitter. We placed 20 pieces between Hakata and Tokyo. There are two flavors, 0.2 grams and 0.5 grams of acid. After 10 days, we will place 30 of them without any signs across Japan. We are preparing a lot more for later. Looking forward to it. Signed, Monster with 21 Faces." 3,500 stores throughout Japan immediately dumped all of their Morinaga inventory. It was devastating to the brand. Police were back on the case immediately, hunting for clues throughout the convenience stores that had poison candy. But there was nothing. No leads. It was like the poison candy had materialized out of thin air. Or worse, been packaged as the Morinaga myself. But then, Family Mart and Yoshinoya got it. They were scanning through their security footage and found a video of a man placing candy on the shelves. The Family Mart had been using the same videotape and security footage for years, recording over old footage multiple times in the process, so the image they collected looked terrible. But at 11:23 on Sunday, October 7th, there's a ghostly, distorted image of a man in his 20s or 30s wearing a baseball cap and metal framed glasses. He also had curved hair. They could see in the video that the man came in, turned to the right, and started thumbing through magazines. He then started walking towards the candy aisle, looking for security cameras the whole way. He then placed a square tin of Morinaga fruit drops on the shelf that were later confirmed to have 0.18 grams of sodium cyanide. Okay, the cops had an image, but who was this man? If it was the Fox-eyed man, the public was going to freak. They all knew he should have been caught months ago. Morinaga was also furious. They had to lay off over 400 employees to cover the cost of the inventory. 400 people with lives to live, families to feed, that were now out of a job. And many of them saw it as the police's fault. The reputation of the Japanese police force was tarnishing quicker than they could do anything about it. By early November, an article titled "Police in Japan, Badges Have Lost Their Sparkle" had been published in the New York Times. In the article, an expert on police matters in Japan, Takuro Suzuki, was interviewed. He said that the Monster with 21 Faces crime was, quote, "a new type of crime for Japan, and the police are using old-style investigation techniques, so they're always behind." This was a huge blow to a police force that was regarded as being one of the best in the world. Only 1 in 7 applicants were accepted to the police academy after taking a rigid exam, and police served in their own neighborhoods, giving them intimate knowledge of the area and the people. But resentment for the police in Japan had been brewing longer than the Monster had been terrorizing the country. Over the summer in Hyogo, the same place where some of the poison candy was left, Miyahiro Azaki was taken from his home. 2 officers had been arrested for robbing a bank in order to pay back loan sharks they owed money to. That was also around the same time that a former police sergeant confessed to killing another police officer and a loan company employee in Kyoto. And remember that almost spotless record for solving homicide cases? Well, the general public was buying it. Over the previous year, 3 men on death row had their sentences overturned after it was revealed that police got those confessions by force. It turns out it was a well-known secret amongst the population in Japan that officers were getting confessions via force and torture, and many of these confessions were false. The autumn dragged it seemed like they did, because something made them stop. On August 7th, 1985, over a year since Izaki's kidnapping, Officer Yamamoto walked into his backyard, doused himself with kerosene, and lit himself on fire. When searching for a reason as to why he may have done this, others in his post believe that he was embarrassed about an event that happened the previous autumn, where he and his subordinates saw the fox-eyed man in a car and let him slip away. The mounting pressure from the public and the mistakes being made by his team were too much for him to bear. Yamamoto was the only death to occur as a result of the monster's hauntings, and after his self-immolation, the monster was never heard of again. It had gotten what it wanted. The monster could still be out there in Japan. If they were in their 20s and 30s when this was happening, they'd only be in their 60s and 70s. I paid my tab $13, can you believe it? Said goodbye to the kind stranger and walked out into the warm, early summer air, chewing over the details of the story. Is the monster still out there? And if he is, what has he shifted into now? A grandfather? A member of his community? Maybe even a kind stranger that sits at a bar and tells a story to whoever will listen. This has been Heart Starts Pounding, written and produced by me, Kayla Moore. Music by Artlist. Special thanks to our new patrons, Emma, Jamie, Hillary, Jessica, Vicky, Jody, Jessica, Andrea, Jen, Carrie, Catherine, Genevieve, Jennifer, Maddie, Jessica F, Jackie, Elise, and Samantha. Another special thanks to Travis Dunlap, Grayson Jernigan, the team at WME, and Ben Jaffe. Have a heart-pounding story you'd like to share or a case request? Check out heartstartspounding.com. Until next time, stay curious.
Curiosity Stream is the streaming service for people who want to know more. Hail the Queens.
This is
Though it was early summer, there was still a chill in the water when Esko Johansen arrived at Lake Bodom on June 5th, 1960. It was the Sunday of a holiday weekend, and Esko lived nearby the lake in the town of Espoo, Finland. He was headed for a swim around 11 a.m. It was typical for locals to spend their weekends out on the lake once the weather warmed up and the sun came back after months of perpetual night. Esko turned off the road and trekked through a short patch of woods towards the lake, and in the distance, about halfway between the road and the water, he saw a tent. That's strange, he thought. It wasn't common, nor particularly safe, for people to camp in these woods. At first, it looked like whoever was camping there had given up on taking down their tent. The site was a mess, belongings strewn everywhere, and the tent was mostly collapsed. He thought he'd check it out, but as he got closer, something didn't feel right. Laying on top of the tent was a boy, about 18 years old, with blood on his face, looking as if he had gotten into a terrible fight. And underneath him, a tangle of 3 other bloodied bodies. Esko couldn't make sense of what he was seeing. His mind was in panic mode, when all of a sudden, the boy on top of the tent took in a sharp breath. "Help me," he gasps, and then falls back unconscious. It's that feeling. When the energy in the room shifts, when the air gets sucked out of a moment, and everything starts to feel wrong. Welcome to Heart Starts Pounding, a podcast of horrors, hauntings, and mysteries. I'm your host, Kaylin Moore. This is a community for people who like to follow their dark curiosity wherever it leads them. Those of us that sometimes spend hours in Reddit black holes, creeping ourselves out way past our bedtimes. If you'd like to dive further into the community, check out our Instagram and TikTok at Heart Starts Pounding, or you can join me on Patreon for some bonus content in what we're calling our Rogue Detecting Society. I want to tell you a story today about one of Finland's greatest unsolved mysteries. It's the tale of a summery, idyllic weekend that turned deadly. 4 teens that were attacked on a camping trip and the mystery that ensued. I thought it was fitting as we plunge straight into summer. And if you're listening to this in the future when it's not summer, I encourage you to build a pillow tent and pillow campfire in your living room and pretend. Let's dive in. June 4th, 1960. It was a beautiful holiday weekend in Espoo, a lakeside town in Finland. 4 teens sped down a winding road by the lake on motorcycles, heading towards an off-road spot in a small patch of woods by Lake Bodom. That's where they were going to set up a tent for the weekend. The drivers were Nils Gustafsson and Seppo Boisman, 2 18-year-old boys that had been best friends for years, and each of them had their girlfriend behind them on their bike as well. Behind Seppo, with her arms wrapped around him and her brown hair whipping in the wind, was 15-year-old Tuleki Maki. She and Seppo had only been dating for a few weeks when she introduced her own best friend, 15-year-old Irmeli Björklund, to Nils. And now, just a week after planning the trip and a few weeks since they all became official, the 2 sets of best friends were kicking off summer with a camping trip. It was, by all accounts, a teenage dream. But as they made their way through the winding streets, stopping in town to pick up some booze and food, the locals couldn't help but look at them with suspicious glances. Sure, Lake Bodom was a beautiful pine tree-lined lake that the community used for fishing and swimming. It wasn't common to see outsiders, though. Espoo was a small town. Everyone knew everyone. And maybe that's why they tensed up when they saw the love-drunk, giggly teens. Espoo was not the place you'd want to be out past midnight in. What were they doing camping out there? It was Nils who chose the spot. He had remembered coming here once before on a boys' fishing weekend and insisted the couples all come together. If it wasn't safe, you'd never guess that from the scene the teens saw as they parked their motorcycles by the trees. They picked out a small clearing in a section of woods that jutted out into the water, making a little peninsula of land, and they set up their cozy 4-person tent. The girls jumped in the water, but it was still the early days of summer, and the lake had just barely warmed up. So the boys decided to sit it out, opting instead to drink some of the pilsners they picked up and eat some food. They watched as other people in the area swam in the lake and rowed around on boats. Nils could feel a shift in the air sometime in the afternoon. He looked up from his camping bag to see that everyone in the area had cleared out. It was now completely empty, except for him and his friends. Where had all the people gone? That night, the group continued swimming, eating, and Nils and Seppo drank a bit more. The girls went to bed first, and later, when Nils crawled into the tent, he could hear Seppo outside, rummaging around in his bag. Nils peeked his head out to see what was happening, and Seppo admitted he couldn't sleep. His mind was restless and he wanted to go fishing to relax. Nils opted to join him, and the 2 boys sat on the shore, drinking and sharing stories. What Seppo was so anxious about, we'll never know, but I can imagine it was some of the anxiety that comes with being a recent high school graduate. The boys had just finished school and were now hit with some of the responsibilities of being adults. They had both gotten jobs that summer to carry some of the financial burden of their families. Plus, there was the issue of what would happen with their girlfriends. Seppo already knew that Tuleki's dad didn't like him that much. On the way to the lake, she had confessed to Seppo that her dad didn't want her to go. Something about the trip didn't feel right to him. Seppo couldn't help but figure it had to do with their relationship. The boys chatted and fished until about 2 a.m. when they came back to the tent, crawled in, and fell asleep. I can't imagine Nils knew that that would be the last time he ever spoke to Seppo.
Wells Fargo presents one of the surest ways to grow your money. A Wells Fargo
Chill everyone on your Fridays.
Fluttered his
That's BlendJet.
eyes of waking up in the hospital. He fluttered his eyes open as he came to, feeling mostly numb except for an intense, deep pain in his jaw. When he went to open it, he found it too painful to do so. Why was he here? What about the camping trip? Where were his friends, and why did his face feel like it went through a windshield? Nils' mother and the nurses who were there in the room were happy to see he was awake, but it quickly became apparent that he had no idea why he was there. The trauma from a head injury had wiped his memory clear of everything that happened to him after he had fallen asleep. They all looked at each other, dreading what they were about to tell him. Nils was informed that Esko Johansson had found the 4 teens beaten and bloody around 11 a.m. the next morning. The scene Esko came upon was particularly dreadful. Tufts of hair, blood, and teeth were scattered around the 4 teens who were wrapped up in a shredded tent. It looked like someone from outside the tent had taken a knife and sliced through it to get to the kids. Esko was sure they were all dead. The flies circling the scene were a giveaway. But that's when Nils started moving. He was alive. Esko ran to the nearest phone and rang the police. Which rooms were his friends in? Nils cried out. His friends weren't in the hospital, the nurse informed him. All of a sudden, Nils' jaw went numb. His whole body went numb. He knew what that meant. This was too much for him to process. He was still trying to make sense of what happened to him, and now he had to mourn the death of his girlfriend, her best friend, his best friend. But before he can even think about all that, the police are on him. Through a haze of painkillers, Nils was interrogated as to what the hell happened that night. But how could he know what caused any of this? He didn't remember anything. He didn't even know his friends had died. It was his parents and doctors that later explained to him that he had a broken jaw and a concussion, which was probably why he couldn't remember anything. Something had hit him in the head after he had fallen asleep. But this wasn't some freak accident, because he was found with defense wounds. Nils' knuckles were bruised and bloody, meaning that whatever happened in the early morning hours of June 5th, Nils fought like hell. The police helped fill in the rest of the gaps for him. He was found at 11 a.m. lying on top of the shredded tent, while his friends were all found still under the tent. It seemed like whoever did this had a knife as well as a flat stone, and both stabbed and beat his friends to death, somehow sparing Nils the worst of it. Though Nils was hit with something hard, he had no knife wounds on him, unlike his friends. From the police's calculations, the attack most likely happened between the hours of 4 a.m. and 6 a.m. Nils, however, was not told about the condition his friends' bodies were found in. That remained a mystery to him until 2004. He knew that his friends died, but he never knew the graphic details until his 60s. The police were still putting together what happened at the scene, and the 3 other teens were sent in for autopsies. Each teen's belongings were collected and sent back to their families, and when Tuleki's brother got her blanket, he could tell immediately that she was not asleep when this attack happened. The hair that had been pulled out. Whatever happened, he could tell Tuliki was awake, and she was fighting back. So what we know now, after the autopsies had happened, is that his friends were found mostly with stab wounds and blunt hits to the neck and head. All of them had defensive wounds, meaning they were all awake at the time of the attack. Irmeli seemed to get the worst of the beating, and when she was found, she was also undressed from the waist down. It was clear from the tears in the tent that whoever did this was not inside the tent. They did enter from the outside. No weapons were found at the scene, but there were two pieces of evidence that were quite strange. First, Nils' shoes were found a few hundred yards from the crime scene, and they were covered in blood. It was unclear why that was the only piece of clothing far away from the tent and why they were discarded so far away. And second, there was a strange pillowcase found outside the tent. It had blood on it, but it was wrapped up and tied on the ends with string, except that the ties had been cut with a knife. It didn't look like anyone had been using it as a pillowcase that night. So if the attack happened from someone outside of the tent, it probably was an intruder, right? Police immediately were suspicious as to why Nils was the only one without knife wounds. It turns out there were a few closed-door conversations being had about the condition Nils was found in. It was weird that his shoes were found so far away from the tent. Was he leaving the scene? The nurses had some concerns as well. They had seen people come in with wounds similar to Nils's. As they described it, his injuries were consistent with getting into a fight or falling from 3 to 6 feet. Neither of those two scenarios had ever resulted in amnesia as bad as what Nils was describing. Temporary amnesia, sure, but not remembering a single thing from the event? That wasn't typical. So suspicions were mounting against Nils, but it was impossible to get any information out of him. He insisted he didn't remember anything. So they started asking around the community for more information, and they found that there were a few people out that night who had seen the campers. So let's run through what some of the witnesses who were out that morning had to say.
Attention shoppers! BlendJet's Black Friday sale is on, and it's our biggest for at
5-year-old daughter.
Fridays.
7 a.m., Martin and Ruth Coley were out on the water with their 5-year-old daughter. They saw the tent on the shore from their boat. They could faintly see feet sticking out of the tangled mess, but thought there had been a bad fight and didn't want to get involved. Then at 10 a.m., 3 teens came to the beach when they saw the campsite. They went up close to the site to see what had happened when they noticed that Nils was lying there in rough shape. According to them, Nils waved and started speaking gibberish. The teens also assumed it had been a bad fight and continued on. So multiple people that morning had seen the group and thought that they had gotten into a horrible fight, and no one called the police. It's really frustrating to hear, but the worst of the injuries were hidden under the tent. They were just seeing Nils with his bloodied face. It may not have been clear from the get-go that 3 people had been brutally murdered. So those witnesses can tell us what happened hours after the murder. But the police were able to track down a few witnesses who saw the teens earlier in the morning, around the time that the murder happened. And they noticed something really interesting. Heikki Salonen and Kalevi Palalainen were 16-year-old birdwatchers who were walking around the area at 5:30 a.m. the morning of the murders. At one point, when the two were near the site, Heikki heard a voice that sounded human. When he looked up in the direction of the voice, he saw 2 motorcycles up against a tree, as well as a piled-up tent with a young man lying on top of it. He described the scene similar to what the other witnesses described, but with one important difference. Headed towards the eastern shore of the Cape, away from the tent, was a man. Heikki remembered him as being an adult person dressed in a light shirt or jacket, but had no other details. The man was 30 meters away from the tent, and from where they stood, it looked like the man on top of the tent was just a hiker starting to wake up, so they felt no need to contact authorities. Olavi Kivaladi was a 14-year-old boy who was out at 6 a.m. that morning to go fishing, and he too remembered seeing a man. He said he was about 50 meters away from a 20 to 30-year-old man who was traveling rather quickly. He described him as having a straight build, straight light brown hair combed back, dark pants, and a light jacket. Olavi didn't mention seeing the tent. So who was the strange man seen leaving the area of the tent? And how would they ever find out who that was? Well, just a day and a half after the attack, someone was admitted to the hospital that made all of the nurses suspicious. After the break. On June 7th, 1960, a man by the name of Hans Osman was admitted to a hospital in Helsinki for stomach pain. He was unconscious when he arrived at the hospital, but it kind of looked like he was faking it. His eyes were squeezed shut as if it were intentional, not like what an unconscious person would be doing. To figure out if he was really unconscious, one doctor used a highly effective medical technique called tickling, which got him to wake up immediately. While a nurse was doing intake, she made note of Hans's appearance. For one, his fingernails were disgusting. It looked like they were caked in dirt, and he had mysterious red stains all over his clothing. His shoes were also muddied and gross. One nurse said it looked as if he'd been running through a forest. Hans was also someone that everyone in the community knew. He was a German workman who had lived in Finland for 10 years, and in that time, he had made quite a name for himself. Mostly because he had ties to the murder of Kaleki Sari, a 17-year-old Finnish girl whose body was found in a bog after she went missing while riding her bike. Hans's car was identical to the car seen at the bog, but he was never convicted for Kaleki's murder. Hans also mostly fit the description. He had blonde hair, which could have been mistaken for light brown in the dark and from a distance. He was 36 at the time of the murders, and he had a build that matched what the boys saw. Hans also lived with his wife in a small house that was on the property of where the teens were killed. It was several kilometers away, but he would have almost definitely been in the immediate vicinity. At the same time that the police were starting to question if Hans was involved, Nils was being taken away for hypnotherapy. The police figured if he couldn't remember anything, Maybe a hypnotherapist could help him dig into his memory bank and remember what happened that night. Hypnotherapy is incredibly controversial in modern forensics, but this was 1960, baby, the heyday of junk psychology. In 1960, you could be hypnotized to bring up a false memory. A psychologist could tell you with a straight face that that memory indicated you wanted to murder your father to marry your mother, and then you could be lobotomized. All in one weekend. But in all seriousness, researchers have found that hypnotherapy does bring up as many false memories as it brings up real ones. Only it increases patients' confidence in the false memories. There have been incredible memories recovered, like the bus driver whose bus was hijacked and buried with 26 kids inside. Under hypnosis, he was able to recall most of the perpetrator's license plate, which led to their arrest. However, many people in the field today are turning their backs on the practice after multiple people have been put on death row over shoddy memories retrieved during hypnosis. I mention all that to say, take this next part with a grain of salt. During Mills's hypnotherapy, the police and hypnotherapist were really keen on getting a description of the man that others had seen. So in this session, the therapist had Nils relax into a meditative state and then worked with him to pull details of a face, the jacket, anything he could out of his memory bank. And Nils started remembering something. At first, it was screams. Nils could hear the sounds of the girls screaming. He could see the outside of the tent being ripped with a knife. And then he remembered seeing a man enter the tent with a knife and what looked like a lead pipe. He said the man had flowy, blonde hair and big eyes. Nils was able to describe more of the facial features for a sketch artist who was in the room, and soon they had a composite sketch of who the man was. There's no doubt that it does look like Hans, and apparently Hans thought so too, because within days of the sketch going wide, he cut his hair short so it didn't match the flyer. That's not enough though, because the police still do question him. At this point, they had questioned thousands of suspects. If you lived in the area, it was pretty much guaranteed that the police were going to be at your door, and they knew Hans lived near where the murders happened. But Hans had an ironclad alibi. See, Hans was having an affair at the time, and the night of the murders, he wasn't in his home. He was with his mistress, who confirmed that he was with her the entire night. Her brother was at the house too and substantiated her story. Police agreed that his alibi was solid. It couldn't have been Hans. They instead turned their focus to two other local men who had criminal records and were known for having short fuses, Arne Loco and Escalonga. But neither of the men seemed to be the guy either. So they took to the streets, interviewing all of the locals and taking photos of the town. One of the photos that was taken by police is of a man named Valu Gilstrom, also known as the Kiosk Man, because he ran a food and drink kiosk in town. The photo is in black and white and shows the kiosk man leaning forward, shirtless, incredulously looking into the camera. It's hard to tell what he's thinking in the photo. Is he suspicious of the police? Or is he hiding something? Police wondered the same thing, but cleared him after a brief search of his home. Witnesses had only seen this mystery man walking away from near the scene. No one saw the murders happen, and it wasn't like they had DNA testing back then. So with Hans's alibi and no other leads to follow, the case turned cold. fading into a bitter winter hibernation. But just because there was no DNA testing when the crime happened doesn't mean that DNA testing couldn't be used in the case. Years later, 43 years later to be exact, in 2003, Nils Gustafsson gets a knock at the door. It's the police, and a new, younger detective has taken on the case. And he's come with an important update for Nils. Nils is being arrested for the murder of his 3 friends, and they believe they have the evidence to prove it was him. After the break. In 2003, the bottom file came off the back shelf and opened up once again. It was a case that had been on every police officer's mind over the last 43 years. But for most of those years, there was nothing they could do. Most of the suspects had died over the years, including Hans Osman. But now, 4 decades later, police had the tools to reopen the case. 2 really important clues were discovered once the tent was sent to the lab and the bodies of the 3 deceased teens were exhumed. DNA profiles and blood types were able to be collected from the teens, giving a much more comprehensive view of the tent that night. Police were now able to see whose blood was where in the tent and confirm exactly whose DNA was there. And that's how they discovered the first clue that made them stop in their tracks. When retesting Nils's shoes, the ones that were found confusingly hundreds of yards from the tent, they realized his blood wasn't on them, just the blood of his 3 friends. And on top of that, they already knew there was no blood inside of his shoes, which made it seem like he had been wearing them at the time of the attack. Could Nils have been the one attacking his friends? That would explain the blood not being on the shoes. Maybe he went outside of the tent, took off his shoes, came back and injured himself to make it not look so suspicious. But, and perhaps most shocking of all, remember that towel that was found outside of the tent? The small wrap towel that had been sliced with a knife? On that towel, they found blood from Irmeli, but they also found DNA from a 5th person, a man who was not part of their friend group. Could this prove that there was another person there that night? The blood on the towel seemed menstrual, leading them to believe Irmeli had been using it as a pad. So police collected DNA from Irmeli's ex-boyfriends and ruled all of them out as suspects. It was looking like this was not someone whom Irmeli had known intimately. In a frustrating turn of events, though, this evidence was used to put Nils on trial for the murder of his friends. The shoes seemed damning, and Nils had kind of been acting suspicious over the years. His story of what happened that night kept changing over the years. He had talked about having stab wounds in his head. Not true. He swore he got dragged out of the tent towards the lake, dropped in the water, and then dragged back. There was no evidence anyone was dragged from the tent that night. The theory that was developed was that Nils must have been horribly drunk that night, gotten ragefully jealous, and killed his friends. The fact that Irmeli got the worst of the teens made it seem like a personal attack. Perhaps she had been flirting with Seppo and Nils couldn't handle it. But what about the 5th person's DNA? Well, after all these years, police kept questioning Hans Osman's alibi. Even though he had passed away years prior, police had always had in the back of their minds that the people corroborating his alibi were maybe coerced into doing so. And now, they were going to have concrete evidence. In a lab in Finland, a technician opens up a box with an old pair of glasses inside. They're Hans's, sent in by his son who wants answers about his father's involvement in the case. He believes that 2 dark specks on the glasses are blood, and the lab tech agrees. So now, the tech is going to figure out if he can get a DNA match. Upon initial testing, he can tell that the speck on the glasses has human DNA. It probably is blood. And not only that, there's 2 separate male DNA profiles in the speck. Could one of them be Seppo or Nils? Could this be the breakthrough in the case that they've needed after all this time? The tech compares the DNA to the boys, and it's not a hit. Not only that, but Hans's DNA is not the DNA on the pillowcase. It wasn't him. Nils was also found not guilty of the murder. The theory of Nils doing this in a jealous and drunken rage was too unbelievable. And then there was the eyewitness testimony of another man leaving the area. Nils also explained that the reason his story changed so much over the years was that he still didn't remember the event. Everything he knew about that night was from what people had told him and what he read in newspapers. And not everyone got it right. DNA evidence also ruled out Arne and Iska. Both men had sons who submitted their DNA to rule out their fathers. So now, over 60 years later, we're back to square one. Still, no one has been charged with the murder, and most suspects have been ruled out. But there is one suspect left that hasn't been completely ruled out. The man in the black and white photo, the kiosk man from earlier. Though police ruled him out early on, apparently people in the community continued to talk. The kiosk man was known for his violent nature around town. One time he hid razor blades in an apple that he served to children. His kiosk was also only 800 meters away from where the kids were camping. The people around town knew not to camp in that area because the kiosk man would cut towards with a long knife, laughing as he watched your tent fall. And rumor has it, he confessed to the killings. The kiosk man drowned in Lake Bodom in 1969, and the rumor around Espoo is that he was having a conversation with a friend when he confessed to the murders. His friend apparently told him that if it were true, if he were really responsible for those kids' deaths, he might as well drown himself in Lake Bodom because that would be better than the life in prison he would live. And within 20 minutes, he was dead, drowned in the lake. But today, it would be easy to see if his DNA matched the DNA found in the tent. The only thing is his son won't submit his DNA to police. They have not been able to get a full DNA profile on the kiosk man. Everything about this case has been a mystery that's plagued Finland for the last 60 years. No motive, no murder weapon, hardly any physical evidence, and now almost everyone involved in the original event has passed away. And you may be thinking, well, one thing doesn't sound that mysterious. Everyone in town felt like it was one guy, the one guy who didn't submit a DNA profile. So surely it must be him. Well, let's look back to the photo. The photo police took of the kiosk man was from the day after the murders. And in it, he's shirtless. And there's not so much as a scratch on his bare skin. After how badly it appeared the kids fought that night, it would be nearly impossible that the killer didn't have scratches or bruises on their skin. So maybe it wasn't the kiosk man after all. Maybe it was some other stranger who committed the crime and was able to slip away into the night without a trace. All we can do is hope that one day we'll get a DNA profile and know for sure. This has been Heart Starts Pounding. Written and produced by me, Kaylin Moore. Music by Artlist. Special thanks to my new patrons, Katie, Maxie, Cassandra, Claire, Nicole, Jeremy, Jessica, Sean, Irama, Riley, Gidget, Beth, Paul, Danielle, Juanita, Inka, Stacy, Christy, Hans, Emily, Lindsay, Ayla, Hannah, Satya, Sophie, Vivian, Joe, Ben, Brittany, Ellie, Shelby, Jennifer, Danny, and Hannah. And another special thanks to Travis Dunlap, Grayson Jernigan, the team at WME, and Ben Jaffe. Have a heart-pounding story or a case request? Check out heartstartspounding.com. Until next time, stay curious. Ooh. Welcome to Heart Starts Pounding, a podcast of horrors, hauntings, and mysteries. I'm your host, Kaylin Moore. So I was thinking about this the other day. I realize I say that at the beginning of every episode. This is a podcast of horrors, hauntings, and mysteries. Each episode tends to fall into one of those categories, and that's by design. My goal was to kind of make it so each week you wouldn't know what you were getting. I think it keeps the content fresh, and for me, it also keeps the research interesting. But today, I want to try something with you guys. I told you last year that I saw a lot of audience growth in India, and so I started poking around for stories, listening to what my audience over there suggested, as well as talking to friends who grew up there. And I realized that there's so much to talk about. India has such a wild history, full of triumph and horror, as well as a folklore and storytelling tradition that expertly weaves in parts of that history. At the end of the day, there were just too many different things that I wanted to include. So in today's episode, I'm gonna do one of each: a horror, a haunting, and a mystery, all from India, to kind of give you a taste of the myths, legends, and true crime that comes from there. And a quick note for today's episode, please give me a little grace on the pronunciations. I looked up everything to get as close as I can, but at the end of the day, I did not grow up speaking Hindi or Marathi, and some sounds my mouth simply cannot make, but I promise, I tried. And first, some quick housekeeping. If you're listening to the ad-supported version of the show, thank you so much. Our advertisers make this show possible. And if you're listening on Patreon, ad-free, well, you're making this possible as well. So thank you. And on that note, we're doing a revamp of our Patreon starting in February. More details on that next week, but we'll be archiving the current $3 tier, our only tier at the moment, and introducing a couple of new tiers. So if you want to get in at $3, make sure you do it before the end of the month. And don't worry, existing patron supporters, you'll be able to continue at $3. Now, we're going to take a really short break, and when we get back, we're going to jump into our first category, a horror. One that takes place on the outskirts of the city of Bengaluru, far away from the pervasive symphony of traffic and under the cover of night. It's about women who disappear and are found dead inside of temples, and the shocking culprit. After the break. This episode is brought to you by HelloFresh. This year, one of the things that I really want to work harder at is being more creative with my meals. I am so bored with everything that I was making in 2023, which is why I'm really excited about today's sponsor, HelloFresh. HelloFresh has more dinner options than ever before. In fact, there are more than 45 dinners to choose from, which is about 10 times more variety than I had in my regular rotation. HelloFresh also sends all of the pre-portioned, farm-fresh ingredients straight to my door, saving me a lot of time. So yes, if you're thinking, Kaylin, you said you wanted to work harder at being more creative, but it sounds like HelloFresh is doing all the work for you. Yeah, you're right. There's different to know where H subscription is free. That's /HS America's #1 meal kit. Our story starts in early December of 2006 on the outskirts of Bengaluru, India's largest southern city. It's sometimes called Bangalore, but for this episode, I'll be referring to it as Bengaluru. There, ornate temples painted head to toe in pinkish white sit against a backdrop of lush trees and rolling mountains. It's a beautiful contrast. In one specific temple, Sri Yogi Narayana, the day is just getting started when a scream rings out from the dormitory area of the temple. Others run over to find out what the commotion is all about, not expecting what they see. The body of a young woman was sprawled out on the floor. Police are called to the scene immediately, but aren't really able to piece together what may have happened. There was no sign of trauma or foul play to the woman's body, no sign of struggle or forced entry into the dorm. It appeared as if she just dropped dead inside of the temple. But she was so young, early 20s maybe. How could that have happened? To make matters worse, they weren't able to identify the woman. She had no identification on her, no one claimed her body, and there wasn't anyone reported missing in the area who matched her description. They end up changing her clothes, bagging the ones she wore when she died as evidence, and burying the body. 3 weeks later, a young woman named Mani calls the police. She's worried about her sister, Renuka. She hasn't heard from her in a few weeks, and that wasn't typical. All of Mani's attempts to get in touch with her sister go unanswered. And so, on December 29th, she calls the police to report Renuka missing. The police ask Mani some questions. What was Renuka doing in the weeks leading up to her disappearance? Well, Mani tells them, she had recently been hanging out with a new friend, an older woman. Mani had been working as domestic help at a family's house where she befriended the cook, a woman who went by the name Malika. She had started hanging out socially with Malika and invited Renuka along a few times, who became fast friends with the woman and quickly got vulnerable with her. Renuka had been struggling to conceive a child, but Malika offered some help. She told her that she could perform a ritual for her at a temple outside of Bengaluru that would ensure Renuka would give birth to a son. That was close to the last time Mani ever saw her sister. And though the police were told that one of the last places Renuka was known to have gone was a temple on the outskirts of the city, no one put it together that the unnamed woman found a few weeks prior might be Renuka. And for a year, Mani was left without any answer as to what happened to her sister. Birthdays passed, holidays, all without word from Renuka. What Mani didn't know was this was becoming a concerning pattern in the area. Women being found dead at different temples on the outskirts of the city, all without signs of struggle, foul play, or forced entry. Typically, they were found by the first people into the temple in the mornings, meaning they most likely died in the dead of night when no one else was there. As the bodies were being found, police had almost no leads as to what was happening. They initially assumed that they were all suicides, though the cause of death was still unknown. But something strange was happening to the bodies. Police were holding on to the bodies of some of the women for testing and identification, and they noticed that they all decomposed at a rate much slower than usual. That was the first thing that tipped him off that something wasn't right. Sure, that can sometimes happen naturally, but that can also happen when there's a toxic substance in the blood of the deceased. Another clue that something was not right came from the families of the women that were found. They noticed that the jewelry their loved one typically wore was missing. Every single body was reported to have gold jewelry taken from it. The next big clue came when they discovered the body of a 60-year-old woman named Yashodama. In late 2007, a year after Renuka went missing, she was found at a different temple, Sri Siddhaganga Mutt, and the police noticed that the SIM card in her phone had been swapped out. They were able to trace her correct SIM card to a phone that was being used by a cab driver in the city. So they started listening in on his calls, trying to figure out how he was tied to the woman. Remember, they still don't think there's any foul play, necessarily. One day, though, he gets a call from a woman, and she tells him to meet her at a bus stop the next morning at 7 a.m. So he does, with the police unknowingly right behind him. When they arrive, there's a middle-aged woman coming from behind the bus stop with a large bag. She huddles close to the cab driver and opens the bag so he can poke around. At this point, the police think they have enough to approach the two and see what's going on. And when they do, they see that the woman's bag is full of jewelry that had been stripped off of the dead women. But that wasn't the only thing the mysterious woman had on her. Inside of small, clear vials in the bag was cyanide. A year after her sister's disappearance, Mani is watching the news when a report comes up that a woman has been arrested for the poisoning deaths of multiple women. When the picture of the woman at the bus stop pops up, Mani recognizes it. It's Malika, the woman who promised her sister a son. Her picture is next to the pictures of 6 other women, all that she had been accused of killing. Except the news wasn't calling her Malika. They were referring to her as K.D. Kampama, India's first female serial killer. K.D. Kampama was born on the outskirts of Bengaluru in the 1960s. She didn't attend school much and married a tailor living in the city in her early adulthood. From what I've read, it seems like from a young age, Kampama was always scheming up ways to make quick cash. In her 20s, she started a chit fund, which is a way for community members to pool money together to loan to one another. It may sound a little sketchy to some listeners, but it's semi-common around the world. And a study done in 2018 found that between 5 and 10% of households in southern India participated in chit funds. The way a chit fund works is an organizer brings together a group of people who each put in a monthly fee to a big fund. So say you get 40 people together, and they each put 1,000 rupees into the fund. The fund is now worth 40,000 rupees. Each month, someone is selected to win most of the pot. Sometimes it's through an auction, and sometimes they're just randomly selected. But that person will win, say, 30,000 of the rupees, and the remaining 10,000 will be split amongst the rest of the group, and a fee will be paid to the organizer. The system goes on for as many months as there are members. It's not a perfect financial model by any means. There are tons of risks. Someone could just bail after winning the pot and no longer pay into the fund. And there's tons of scam ones where an organizer will just collect the money for a fund and take off. But when it works and people are honest, it can be a good way to get a low-interest loan from friends and family. But I will say the person who has the highest chance of actually making money in this scenario is the organizer, who was Kempema. Only she must have done a horrible job at organizing this chit fund because she nearly lost all of the money that she had put into the fund. And when her husband found out in 1998 because bill collectors were nearly knocking down his door, he left her. With nowhere to live and now no income, Kempema went into the line of domestic help, but the scheming did not stop. At this time, she was robbing the homes she cleaned. At one point, Kempema had worked in a jewelry store and noticed that gold was dissolved in cyanide. She figured if it was strong enough to do that, surely it would kill someone when ingested. Her connections at this store supplied her with cyanide during her killing sprees. And it wasn't long before she graduated from robbing homes to something more sinister. A year later, she started lurking inside of temples on the outskirts of Bengaluru, surrounded by hills and lush forests, where the swelling sounds of traffic were a little duller. She'd go to beautiful, ancient temples with tall gold roofs and men in bright orange robes who led prayer. There, she would look for vulnerable women, posing as a concerned member and offering services. That's where she met Mamta Rajan, a wealthy 30-year-old woman, and her first victim. In 1999, Kempema asked Mamta to meet her under the cover of darkness. She knew that the young woman was struggling in her personal life, and she promised that she could do a ritual that would bring her a better future. While the two were alone in the temple, Kempema asked her to drink some of her holy water. Mamta didn't know it then, but the holy water was laced with a lethal amount of cyanide. The poison worked immediately, killing the 30-year-old in just a few minutes. Kempema took the jewels off of her body and disappeared into the night. And though she'd go on to take more lives, she was almost stopped after the first one. In 2000, Kempema was arrested for stealing valuables from a home she was performing a religious ritual in. There's not much information on this event, but this could have been part of the scam she was running to rob wealthy women she met at temples. She was caught trying to steal jewels from the woman who lived in the house. Ultimately, though, she only spent 6 months in jail. This was definitely not enough to teach her a lesson, and it seems like after being incarcerated, she doubled down on her deadly schemes. In 2007, it's believed she killed 5 women within 3 months, from October to December. The first woman she targeted during this spree was a 52-year-old woman named Elizabeth. Kempema had noticed that Elizabeth had a granddaughter that went missing. She approached Elizabeth with the same promise she had made Mamta. that she could perform rituals and prayers that would aid in the search for Elizabeth's granddaughter. All Elizabeth had to do was wear her most valuable clothing and jewelry to the ceremony. The next victim was the 60-year-old woman named Yashodhama, the one who had her SIM card swapped. She was suffering from asthma and was promised relief by Kempama. She was lured to a temple after hours when no one else was around to witness the meeting. And this occurred at a different temple than the others, as Kempama was careful to not visit the same temple too many times. She was also changing her name each time she searched for a victim. This is probably how she was able to avoid police detection for so long. After Yashodhama, Kempama went after a 60-year-old woman named Muniyama at a different temple on the outskirts of the city. She wanted to be a singer of devotional songs, and Kempama promised her she could achieve her dreams if she just drank some of her holy water. Then there was Palama, a 60-year-old temple priest. Kempama had promised to sponsor an arch for her temple, but when the two met, she tricked her into drinking the cyanide as well. The last woman Kempama killed during the spree was a 30-year-old woman named Nagaveni, who was having trouble conceiving a child. Kempama had approached her at a temple and listened to her problems and worries to quickly build trust. She told her she would perform a ritual at a temple for her one night. All Nagaveni had to do was bring her best jewelry. There, Kempama did what she had done so many times before. Presented the young woman with holy water to drink, watched as she died a slow and agonizing death, and then stole the jewels right off her body. Mani watched as the TV replayed these crimes in horror as the memory of her sister racked her brain. Though Kempama had confessed to the murder of these women, she hadn't confessed to the killing of Renuka, which confused Mani. She called the police again after learning of Kempama's crimes and told them the situation, that she had befriended the murderer before she had promised her sister a baby boy. The police had preserved the clothing of the body they found in the temple a year earlier, and Mani confirmed that, yes, those were her sister's clothes. Renuka had been killed in a temple, just like the others. And Mani wasn't the only person coming forward to say that Kempama knew their missing loved one. At least 3 other people came forward to suggest that Kempama was responsible for more deaths. In the end, Kempama was charged with 13 counts of murder, but only convicted of 6. She was given 2 death sentences for the murder of Muniyama and Nagaveni, though they were eventually lessened to life sentences. She's currently serving her life sentences in Parapana Agrahara Central Prison. Kempama promised young, vulnerable women a better life, but instead, she killed them in cold blood to steal a little bit of jewelry. She's known as India's first female serial killer, though it's unclear if she killed for the thrill or just to make some quick cash. And her prison sentence will never repay the families of those she killed of what they lost. We're gonna take a quick break, and when we get back, I want to dive into our next category and walk you through one of India's most terrifying hauntings. For our next story, we're heading up to the north of India, past Delhi, to outside of the city of Dehradun. Here, folklore and myths surround the nature of the area. Rivers are believed to have mystical healing properties, and there are caves where it's said Indian robbers hid out from British colonists. The gently flowing shallow river at the base of the cave concealed the footprints of those trying to get away. If you took the winding roads up the hills until you were high enough to get a view of the Himalayas, you'd find yourself in Mussoorie. And there, you might hear locals talking about something paranormal that resides in the woods. This tale of these woods comes from Jay Alani, a paranormal investigator in India. It's from his book Haunted: Real-Life Encounters with Ghosts and Spirits. Back in 2015, Jay received a call from a real estate broker. At the time, he was making YouTube videos about hauntings in India, so he was used to being reached out to by people who thought they were experiencing something paranormal. But he never experienced anything like this. The man said that his firm owned a beautiful plot of land on the outskirts of Mussoorie. It had everything a real estate developer would want. A gorgeous view of the Himalayas, an amazing destination to develop vacation homes, and a low asking price. But, the broker explained, they couldn't sell it. No matter how low they set the price, once buyers heard where the land was, they would immediately end the phone call. They all say there's something wrong with that piece of land, he explained, that it has some sort of negative energy. The man asked Jay to investigate and prove once and for all that the area was safe. So together, they went to Mussoorie. And when they arrived, they saw an old abandoned mine, the Lambi Dehar mine. Only pieces of the old mine and buildings remained. Decrepit concrete staircases that went off to where a second floor once stood. Crumbling walls that once held a bustling and lucrative limestone quarry. It was spooky looking. No wonder locals thought it had negative energy. But the remains could be easily cleared. First, Jay explained, they needed to find a trusted local who could explain to them why people were so afraid of the land. They came upon a lone chai tea and biscuit shop on a path in the woods, owned by an elderly man, and they asked him if there was a story about the land they were on. They're thinking that he'll just say that the mine is creepy and dangerous. But in a quivering voice, he tells them to come in, closing the door behind them. He pours them both a mug of chai tea and asks, "Have you heard about the salt witch of the mines?" Jay and the broker's eyes went wide, and they shot each other a look. This is the story that the man told them. The story begins almost 200 years ago, back in 1827, when India was still under British rule. Mussoorie was an unknown small town back then, but that didn't stop a British officer from falling in love with the place. The view of the Himalayas was unlike anything he had ever seen. He'd spend his days walking through the woods, exploring the land that had been uncharted by the British. One day, he came upon a small hut at the top of one hill, where a lone woman lived. What he didn't know was that locals tended to stay away from this woman. She was, let's say, eccentric. But the officer still went over to her home, where he found her cooking over a large pot and singing to herself. He was welcomed in and offered tea, and he asked her why she lived all by herself. Where was her family? "I'm a nomad," she told him in an uncommon dialect of Hindi. "This is how my people have always lived." He drank his tea quickly and headed back towards his home. When he arrived, he noticed that there was a strange, white powdery substance all over his shoes that he tracked into his house. The man smiled wide when he realized what it was. Limestone, and a high-quality limestone at that. See, in that particular area of India, the mineral was so prevalent that you could pick up limestone rocks off the forest floor. This would make him rich. The English used tons of limestone to make cement. Plus, it's a resource that's found close to the Earth's surface instead of deep underground. And so the officer knew that he'd have easy access to an almost unlimited supply. He immediately ordered mines to be built all across the area for the British. In doing so, however, he displaced the woman in the woods. She was never seen again. Soon, the Lambi Dehar mines, the mines that the broker and Jay passed on their way in, were up and running, owned by the British but mostly employing the local Indian population. The mines operated pretty consistently until the 1990s. That's when tragedy struck. One day, in 1996, a woman and her young son showed up to the gates of the mines to deliver lunch to her husband. It was common for wives to bring lunch to their husbands during breaks from carrying limestone up the quarry. But the woman left her son at the gate and slipped into the mines. A gatekeeper remembered seeing the boy playing at the gate alone, but when he turned around and looked back, the boy was gone. He radioed for someone to find the woman, but she was nowhere to be found either. Later that evening, when the mines were full, a terrible crashing sound echoed throughout the mountainous region. The entryway to the mines had collapsed, trapping all of the workers inside. A green, noxious gas filled the sealed underground area, making the men's skin peel off down to the bone. Between 20 and 50,000 workers were killed. People in town say that their screams can still be heard at night. The man in the chai shop told the two men. The woman was a chudel, a solitary witch, one that lives alone and does not like company. She becomes vengeful when disturbed and can change shape, form, and age. The man in the shop believed that she was finally getting her revenge from the British, shutting down their mine for good, even at the expense of her own people. This is actually a legend that's been around for some time, and there's been different versions of it. Some say that due to horrible working conditions at the mines, workers started dying. Their lungs were irritated by the limestone particles in the air, and they'd start coughing up blood. The number of deaths stays the same, though. Between 20 and 50,000 workers died in this version. It is hard to find reports on this, as it seems these catastrophic events were not documented in papers at the time. One report does say, however, that there was a furnace that exploded at the top of the mine in 1990, killing about 50 workers. Perhaps the legend has grown and been embellished over time, but it doesn't change the fact that many people died here in an accident, and the locals swear that echoes of the event can still be heard in the area. And they all agree that it was the doing of the witch. One sighting in the area that people have not been able to explain is a strange blue glow that emanates from inside of the tunnels. Some have tried to say that the glow is from radium, but scientists have argued against this. They say there's nothing radioactive in the mines, so radium couldn't be the culprit. Others have tried to explain away the strange noises and sights at the mine as well. Some say that the mine leaks methane gas, which causes visitors to hallucinate. But again, scientists have argued against this. That night, Jay and the broker took ghost hunting equipment into the mines and decided that, yes, there was paranormal activity happening in the area. Though it was unclear exactly what happened there, the energy was definitely still lingering. And the broker looked terrified. Maybe because he knew there was something paranormal there. Or maybe because he knew he would never be able to sell the land. No matter how many people tried to explain it away, nothing ever sticks, and residents swear the terror of the land's history can still be heard today, booming throughout the hills until the witch gets her land back. Our last story takes us south again. 333 miles, or 530 kilometers, southeast of Delhi, in the eastern Indian city of Mirzapur, which is in the state of Uttar Pradesh. Uttar Pradesh is the most populated state in India, and it's where you can find the Taj Mahal. Mirzapur is in the southernmost part of Uttar Pradesh and is home to thick jungles and majestic waterfalls. This is where one of the strangest unsolved mysteries I've read about occurred. In August of 2002, the BBC reported that 10,000 residents of Mirzapur gathered outside of a police precinct in a growing mob. As their shouts of anger grow, gunshots ring out, and a man falls to the ground, sending the crowd around him running. If you were to ask anyone in the mob, this was yet another casualty of the strange phenomena attacking their community. The reason they were at the police station in the first place. They had been complaining to police for months that someone or something was attacking them, only to be shrugged off. It's all in your mind, the police would say. But for the people of Mirzapur, it was real. For the last few months, there had been sightings of strange balls of light that would attack people and leave them with welts on their faces. It started when people who slept outside in the region to escape the heat would wake up with mysterious scratches and red marks on their faces. But soon, people started seeing what they thought was the culprit. It was a circular object that floated through the air and emitted beams of green and red light. Some people reported that this object was the size of a hawk, but others swore it was as big as an aircraft. They said it would approach them and scratch their face, earning it the name of Munachwa, or face scratcher. As word spread of the cryptid, residents in the area started panicking. They stopped sleeping outside despite the oppressive heat and made sure that clubs and other weapons in their home were never far from reach. Though there's no official reports of people dying from the strange glowing orb, people swore that it was killing their neighbors. There are, however, reports of deaths from the panic. Kumar Barai of Jamalpur had a cardiac stroke just hearing stories about the object. There was the man who was killed by police when the mob formed at the station, and a few days later, another man was shot by police in the town of Barabanki. When the town of Barabanki started to mob at their police station, people were losing sleep. Families would stay up in shifts to make sure the object didn't invade their home while they slept. Some people even patrolled the streets by banging big drums to scare off any invaders. One man woke up in the middle of the night and started beating his own father, mistaking him for the Munochwa. Another accidentally killed his pet dog when he felt something lick his face while he slept. And since the police wouldn't do anything, the community took it upon themselves to figure out what was causing it. At first, they thought maybe it was something electrical attracted to the antennas on their roofs. So they took those down, though to no avail. Some reports even say that terrified villagers were killing other community members they suspected of being a Munochwa. One night, someone saw one traveling near a parked car that had a person sitting in the front seat. This led some people to believe it could have been a drone that someone was operating, though that was never proven. Someone else suggested that it was some sort of strange insect released into India by a foreign adversary. A police officer captured a weird-looking bug that he thought may be the culprit. A 3.5-inch long winged insect. Police decided that this must be the offender, and KP Singh, a superintendent of police, made a statement saying that this kind of bug leaves rashes and superficial wounds on people's faces. The villagers did not believe that for a second. Other wild theories included extraterrestrials or a robot that glows and was brought into Uttar Pradesh by foreign attackers. It got so desperate that the state government even asked the Indian Institute of Technology to help them solve this mystery. Their explanation? Balls of lightning. They said that the area was extremely dry before monsoon season, and the atmosphere was causing a phenomenon where balls of lightning appear out of nowhere. These types of lightning balls were really common in New Zealand, but could be found in different parts of Europe and the US. They travel sideways and quickly, which may account for the appearance of them flying. They dissipate after they hit an object and should disappear once the monsoon season arrives. So, sure, maybe people in the community were being hit in the face with balls of lightning while they slept. Or maybe it was a mysterious insect sent by a foreign country. To this day, those are kind of the best guesses we have. The students didn't actually observe the Munochwa to see if that's what it was. But there is one other theory. And this is based on something that happened in Delhi just a few years earlier. There's the theory that this was a shared delusion, an instance of mass hysteria. And the reason some psychologists believe that is because of the Monkey Man of Delhi. In mid-2001, people reported seeing a 4-foot monkey-like creature around the streets of Delhi. Reports varied, but from what people said, it sounded terrifying. It had a metal helmet on and metal claws, red glowing eyes, 3 buttons on its chest, and was covered in thick black hair. Some people said it was much taller, some people said it wore roller skates, but almost everyone described it as looking like a terrifying monkey. Over 350 people reported seeing this creature in Delhi, and around 60 of those sightings resulted in injuries. 2 people were said to have fallen off of the tops of buildings when they were running away from the monkey man who they thought was chasing them. Though so many people were saying they saw this creature, police never caught anything, and the whole ordeal is now looked back on as an instance of mass hysteria. Eventually, sightings of the Munochwa stopped. Maybe it was the heavy storms of monsoon season that made them disappear. Or maybe the cultural hysteria died down and people just forgot about them. But it still could have been something else. Maybe it really was bugs sent by a foreign adversary, or crazier yet, aliens. We just may never know. Okay, we're gonna take another quick break, and when we get back, I have one more little treat for you. I'm gonna read you a spooky listener tale sent in from Mumbai. Someone who experienced something unexplainable in India for themselves. Our final tale comes from Amanat in Mumbai. Amanat had a strange and unexplainable sighting in India some years back and wanted to share what she saw. And heads up, parts of this story are a little intense. She writes, "Hello from Mumbai, India. I found your podcast a few weeks ago and I've been addicted ever since. I wanted to share my story with you. It might not be extremely terrifying, but it quite honestly changed my take on the supernatural and actually led me here. So, it's 2017 and I'm volunteering to take a batch of children, I was an alumni of the school, to Delhi and Agra to see the Taj Mahal. We checked into a hostel which had 2 wings, both connected by a simple yet long corridor. I was assigned a dorm with 7 girls, who, after a long day of sightseeing, were exhausted. After completing some chores, I went off to bed in the lower bunker. It was quiet, a little too quiet, and there was ample moonlight. Something woke me up, and as I turned, I saw a figure that walked past me. It was a short woman in a long skirt, but she was not human. She had a head of a goat with long horns and hands that looked like sticks. I brushed it off and went back to sleep since I was so tired, but I noticed the time was 3:03 a.m. I had a feeling I saw something supernatural, but I had never been scared of ghosts, so I just let it slide. Fast forward to the next night when a boy from the other wing fell sick and I was called in to attend to him. The corridor had a light green tone on the walls and it was dimly lit and very, very quiet. As I walked to the other side of the corridor, I glanced around the paintings and the photos hung on either side of the walls. And there she was. The goat lady. A massive chill ran down my spine and I had goosebumps. I panicked and broke out into a sweat. I didn't sleep at all that night or any other night for the following 2 weeks to come. I would wait until it was past 4 a.m. and then get a few hours in. I can still recall so vividly how she looked. She was transparent-ish, but her features were stark. On the same trip, a few days after this incident, we visited a mosque that had a stepwell notoriously famous for black magic and exorcisms. While we only wanted to show the children the beautiful mosque, I happened to witness a live exorcism that was rather traumatic and extremely scary. A presumably possessed woman lay tied to the ground with ropes while her family sat in front of her chanting prayers and performing rituals. The exorcist, or Pir Baba as Muslims call it, started banging her head with a stone until blood would drip on the ground. She was screeching and changing voices, trying to break free and in complete distress. The entire scene lasted about 30 seconds before I could comprehend what was happening and bolted in the opposite direction. But that scene stayed with me. For weeks after the trip, I would be mortified by everything supernatural. I would start crying in fear of my house getting haunted. I couldn't see horror shows or movies anymore. I would change the topic if it was ever brought up, and for 2 years, I was extremely scared of everything related to spirits and ghosts. The anxiety was crippling. But then, something snapped in me. I had a master's in psychology, and I wanted to use some techniques to help myself since it was affecting me mentally. I chose systematic desensitization as it felt most fitting. So I'm here now, ironically finding comfort in your podcast among other spooky shows and movies. It's helping me understand the other world better and embrace it. I'm not a great writer, and I don't know if this would be enough to share on your podcast, but thank you so much for taking the time to read it and allowing me to share. This is the first time I've actually put all of this into words. Amanat, I think you're a great writer, and I'm glad the podcast has acted like a type of exposure therapy for you. For as scary as the goat-headed monster was, I cannot imagine experiencing someone going through an exorcism like that. But unfortunately, that's still practiced in some parts of the world. But the blend of horror, both of our world and another, with hope, just felt really symbolic of this episode as a whole. Amanat ended up writing a follow-up email to me explaining that this experience made her feel more empathy towards people and made her more receptive to challenges in her life. So even though the experience was terrifying, she was able to find a little good in it. And I think that's really beautiful. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Heart Starts Pounding and maybe learned something a little terrifying about India. I will say, though the research was, yes, terrifying, it also really illuminated for me how beautiful the landscape of India is. The beautiful waterfalls of Mirzapur, the enchanted waters in Dehradun, the hills of Mussoorie, and there's nothing I love more than something beautiful with a dark history. This has been Heart Starts Pounding, written and produced by me, Kayla Moore. Sound design and mix by Peachtree Sound. Special thanks to Travis Dunlap, Grayson Jernigan, the team at WME, and Ben Jaffe. Special thanks to our new patrons. You will be thanked by name in our monthly newsletter. Have a heart-pounding story or a case request? Check out heartstartspounding.com. Until next time, stay curious. Ooh. January 3rd, 1972. 3 forest workers, Beltran Paredes, Carlos Vasquez, and Nestor Amasifuen, walk deep into the Peruvian rainforest. Above them, the sky is a dark gray, casting a deep shadow through the already shaded jungle. This part of the rainforest is so dense and thick that the canopy blocks out most of the sun, even on a good day. They almost stayed home. The rain was supposed to be bad, and they wondered if they should just come out tomorrow. But something in Carlos told him they should go. And so, here they were, heading towards their station, deep in one of the most isolated places on the planet. As the 3 men walk forward, they hear something in the distance. They slow down and scan the forest. Most of what they would find in this part of the Amazon would be harmless. Monkeys, sloths, anteaters. But on the off chance they were being stalked by a jaguar, they wanted to be ready. They follow the noise when underneath the makeshift tent where they're supposed to be stationed, Carlos sees something that makes his eyes go wide. The others follow his gaze, expecting to see a predator. They could have never guessed what was walking towards them. It was a girl, but one that looked unlike anyone he had ever seen in the area. She was about 17 years old, with platinum blonde hair and big, red eyes. She was covered in mud and had a bad wound on her leg. Gasoline dripped down her arm. Who was this girl? There were no white people in this part of Peru, only a few scattered locals with tan skin and dark hair. Beltran couldn't believe his eyes. And for a moment, he wondered if he should kneel before her. He had heard legends of who this woman must be. Yacumama, the Peruvian jungle's water goddess. Often portrayed as a snake, it was said that if a pregnant woman looked at Yacumama, she would come back and take the child. She was to be feared. But before he can kneel down and show his respect, in perfect Spanish, the girl says to them, "I'm the girl who was in the Lanza crash. My name is Juliana." This stops the men right in their tracks. If she had told them her name was Yacumama, the serpent water goddess, they would have probably believed her more. The men had heard about what happened with the Lanza plane, a plane heading from Lima to Pucallpa that fell apart in the sky during a thunderstorm. "Have they found my mom?" the girl says. And all of the men look at each other with sorrowful eyes. No one had found her mother. They hadn't even recovered a single piece of the plane since it crashed over a week ago. The search had been called off. They said there was no way anyone could have survived. They had a lot to tell her, but more importantly, there was a lot she needed to tell them. It's that feeling when the energy in the room shifts, when the air gets sucked out of a room, and everything starts to feel wrong. It's the instinct between amazing. It's when your heart starts pounding. Welcome back to Heart Starts Pounding, a podcast of horrors, hauntings, and mysteries. I'm your host, Kaylin Moore. This is a community for people with a dark curiosity, my kinds of people, and I'm so glad I've found you all and you've chosen to gather here. You know how I can tell you're my kinds of people? Because of how many messages I get where the top line will be something like, I saw this and thought of you, and then it'll be like the darkest, most disturbing thing you've ever read. Multiple people saw a story about a wild boar that killed its owner and sent it to me saying, saw this and thought of you. You guys are unhinged and I love it. Let's talk about flying for a second, because that's a big part of today's episode. Some of you are probably not afraid of flying at all, and that's for a good reason. We're currently in a golden age of airline safety. In 2021, there were 1.93 accidents per million departures globally, and in 2022, there were even less than that. And only 8% of those accidents had any fatalities. Those numbers become even more safe if you're flying within the United States. The last fatal commercial airline crash in the US was in 2009, and safety regulations were put in place immediately afterwards to make sure it never happened again. Pilots were given shorter shifts and more time to rest in between flights. And since those were implemented, history hasn't repeated itself. And yet, every time I step foot on a plane, I immediately start to panic. Flying has always been a horrible fear of mine, even though there's no evidence that really backs that fear up. We have a much higher chance of crashing our car on the way to the airport than we do of being in a plane crash. But because of this, morbidly, I like to read about plane crashes. It's like pouring salt in the wound. It's probably the same reason we watch scary movies or TikToks about the North Sea. We like to be scared. We're little freaks. I don't know. But today, I want to tell you a story that is so much more than just a plane crash story. Yes, one of the most terrifying things I could ever imagine happened to Juliana Kopka, but her calmness and resilience in the aftermath led to her survival. At 17 years old, she was braver than I'll ever be. Juliana's story is one of hope, of how far the human spirit can push, of miraculous survival. And today, I want to tell you that story. But before we dive in, I want to say thank you. There are many ways to listen to this show. You may be listening to the free ad-supported version. You might be listening to the ad-free version because you're a Patreon subscriber. Or you could be listening ad-free through our new Heart Starts Pounding premium subscription on Apple Podcasts. You could even be listening against your will because your significant other plays the podcast really loud in the car. I don't know, but regardless of how you're listening, thank you for being here. You are the reason this show exists. I would not be able to talk about what horrible thing I've been hyperfixating on without all of you, so thank you. And if you haven't had a chance to check out our February bonus episode on the scariest stories from the internet this month, you might want to check that out. I talk about the viral Grimes crime story about a foster family who sewed their children into animal costumes, as well as the trailer of the new Nickelodeon tell-all documentary, Quiet on Set. I was especially interested in talking about that one because I used to work on a kids show. So you definitely don't want to miss that. And it's streaming now on Patreon and our Apple subscription. Okay, we're going to take a quick break. And when we get back, we're going to start from the beginning. And as always, listener discretion is advised. I want to take a second to tell you about a new book you have to check out. Tender Beasts by Lizelle Sambury is a dark academia thriller with a paranormal twist. And if that doesn't hook you right away, let me tell you what it's about. Sunny is trying to maintain her wealthy family's picture-perfect facade after her mother's death.
But when her estranged brother is accused of murdering one of her classmates, Sunny must uncover the truths and the monsters behind her parents' legacy. Soon, she may have to choose whether to preserve the family she's always loved or protect the brother she barely knows, and risk losing everything her mother worked so hard to build. This book is a really juicy murder mystery, and you will tear straight through it. If you like mind-bending horror stories that keep you up at night, and I would assume you do because you're listening to this podcast after all, you don't want to miss Tender Beasts by Lascelles Sambury. Available wherever books are sold. Juliana Kopka arrived at the Lima airport with her mother early in the morning on December 24th, 1971. They were trying to make it back to their remote town in Peru in time to see her father for Christmas. Juliana had just graduated high school in Lima, and she was really eager to see him. Their hopes sank once they got to the airport, though. It was packed. The day before, many flights had been canceled, and now hundreds of passengers looking for another ride home for the holidays were crowding the terminal. Juliana doesn't hear it over the cacophony of shouts, but there's another native German speaker sternly talking to a ticketing agent in heavily accented Spanish. His flight was canceled the day before, and now he's desperately trying to get on Juliana's flight with his crew. They're filming a movie in the jungle in Pucallpa, and he needs to get to set. Is there any way he can get on that flight? The agent just shakes her head. No, it's a full flight, and even then, it might just get canceled today. By tomorrow, this man will understand how this moment saved his life. He'll hear the news of the crash, and a deep, existential chill will rumble through his body. It's a feeling most of us haven't felt, the overwhelming feeling of our own mortality. It will change his life forever. But in this current moment, as he's being shut down by the ticketing agent, he's pretty pissed off. Juliana isn't paying attention to that, though. She's paying attention to two American boys that are her age. She knows a little bit of English, and she tries to keep up with them. They're just like Juliana. They're in Peru because their parents are linguists who are studying the language of indigenous people living in the Peruvian rainforest. Juliana is in Peru because her parents are biologists that couldn't find work in Germany after the war. They opted instead to travel to Peru, where the ecology and biodiversity still had so much to be explored. Her mother, specifically, was an ornithologist. She studied birds, and everything she knew about birds made her that much more afraid to fly. She just didn't understand it. Birds had hollow bones. They had to be light to fly. So how could a massive metal tube stay in the air? After hours of waiting, at around 11 a.m., their flight is finally called. Juliana, her mother, and the boys she was talking to all grabbed their things and board. She remembered as she was boarding, finding out that their flight actually had a name, Mateo Pumacahua, named after the famed rebel who helped liberate Peru from the Spanish in the early 1800s.